I discovered the cameras on a Tuesday morning when I was brushing my teeth in my bathroom, and the glint of a lens caught my eye through the frosted window, pointed directly at my home in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. My name is Marcus Webb, and I had lived in the Saguaro Springs community for 3 years without major incident. The development was one of those cookie-cutter neighborhoods built in the early 2010s, with beige stucco houses, red tile roofs, and strict rules about everything from mailbox colors to the acceptable height of your grass. I worked as a software developer from home, which meant I spent most of my time in my house, appreciating what I thought was my private sanctuary. That morning changed everything. I set down my toothbrush and moved closer to the window, squinting through the textured glass. There, mounted on a pole in the common area about 20 feet from my property line, was a black dome camera. The angle was unmistakable. It was not pointing at the street or the walking path. It was aimed directly at the side of my house, where my bathroom window, bedroom window, and home office window were located. My stomach dropped. I walked through my house, checking each window on that side. From my bedroom, I could see the camera even more clearly. From my home office, where I spent 8 to 10 hours a day, the camera had a perfect view right into my workspace. I felt violated, exposed, like someone had been watching me for who knows how long without my knowledge or consent. I threw on jeans and a t-shirt and headed outside. The Arizona sun was already beating down, even though it was only 8 in the morning. I walked the perimeter of my property, examining the camera from different angles. There was no question about it. This was not a security camera meant to monitor common areas or deter crime. This was surveillance pointed at my private residence. I pulled out my phone and took several photos, documenting the camera's position and angle. Then I noticed something else. There was a second camera mounted on another pole closer to the community park area, also angled in a way that captured my backyard and the rear windows of my house. My hands were shaking as I photographed that one too. I had dealt with the HOA before over minor things. They had sent me a violation notice once because my garbage cans were visible from the street on a non-trash day. Never mind that it was because the collection truck had missed my house, and I had forgotten to bring them in immediately. They had also complained when I planted desert marigolds in my front yard instead of the approved landscaping list, even though desert marigolds were native plants that required less water. But this was different. This was not about aesthetics or property values. This was about my fundamental right to privacy in my own home. I went back inside and immediately started researching Arizona privacy laws. I learned that Arizona was a one-party consent state for recording conversations, but that applied to audio. For video surveillance, the laws were more complex, especially regarding reasonable expectation of privacy. Citizens had a right to privacy in places where they would reasonably expect it, like inside their homes. Installing cameras that deliberately captured the interior of someone's residence could potentially violate both state privacy laws and federal wiretapping statutes. I also discovered that HOAs, while granted broad authority to enforce rules and maintain common areas, did not have unlimited power. They could not violate residents' constitutional rights or break state and federal laws, regardless of what their governing documents said. Armed with this information, I decided to approach the situation methodically. I drafted a formal letter to the HOA board, outlining my concerns and requesting the immediate removal or reorientation of the cameras. I included timestamps and photos showing exactly what the cameras could see. I cited relevant Arizona revised statutes regarding privacy and video surveillance. I kept my tone professional but firm, making it clear that this was a serious legal issue, not just a neighborly complaint. The HOA management company was called Prestige Community Management, and they handled several developments in the Phoenix area. I sent my letter via certified mail to ensure there was proof of delivery. I also sent a copy via email to create a digital trail. Then I waited. 3 days later, I received a response. Not from the management company, but from Patricia Bloomfield, the HOA board president. Patricia was exactly the kind of person you would imagine in that role. A woman in her mid-50s with a blonde bob haircut that never moved, oversized sunglasses perpetually perched on her head, and an attitude that suggested she believed the entire neighborhood existed for her personal oversight. I had seen her patrolling the streets in her white Lexus SUV, looking for violations like some kind of suburban sheriff. Her email was curt and dismissive. She wrote that the cameras had been installed for security purposes following several reports of vandalism in the common areas. She claimed they were positioned to monitor HOA property and that any incidental capture of my home was unavoidable given the layout of the community. She suggested that if I was concerned about privacy, I should invest in better window coverings. The email ended with a reminder that as a homeowner in Saguaro Springs, I had agreed to abide by all HOA rules and decisions when I purchased my property. I read the email 3 times, my anger building with each pass. The gaslighting was incredible. Incidental capture implied the cameras just happened to catch a glimpse of my house while doing their intended job. But I had photographic evidence that these cameras were deliberately angled at my windows. There was nothing incidental about it. I also knew the vandalism claim was questionable. I had lived here for 3 years and had not heard about any significant vandalism issues. The community Facebook group, which people used to complain about everything from loose dogs to stolen packages, had no recent posts about vandalism. Patricia was manufacturing a justification after the fact. I decided it was time to escalate. I contacted a lawyer named Richard Chen who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. His office was in Scottsdale, about 30 minutes from my house. I scheduled a consultation for the following Monday. Richard's office was in a modern building with floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist furniture. He was in his early 40s, wearing a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and he listened intently as I explained the situation. I showed him my photos, the HOA's response, and the research I had done. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "This is pretty egregious," he said. HOAs generally have the right to install security cameras in common areas, but those cameras cannot be positioned in a way that invades residents' reasonable expectation of privacy. The fact that these cameras are pointed directly at your windows, especially your bedroom and bathroom, is a clear violation. "So what are my options?" I asked. "We can send a demand letter first," Richard explained. "That's a formal legal notice that outlines the violations and demands corrective action within a specific time frame. We will cite Arizona privacy statutes, as well as the Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search. We will also mention potential civil claims for invasion of privacy and intentional infliction of emotional distress. If they do not comply, we file a lawsuit. How long does this process usually take? If they are smart, they will remove or relocate the cameras within a few weeks after receiving the demand letter. No HOA wants to go to court over something this clear-cut. But if they dig in, which some do out of stubbornness or pride, we are looking at several months of litigation. Maybe longer if it goes to trial, I thought about it. The idea of months of legal battles was exhausting, but the idea of living under constant surveillance was worse. "Let's do it," I said. "Send the demand letter." Richard nodded. "I will have it drafted and sent out by the end of the week. In the meantime, document everything. If you notice any changes in the camera positions, any communication from the HOA, any harassment, write it down. Take photos, save emails. Everything is potential evidence." I left his office feeling both relieved and anxious. Relieved that I was taking action, anxious about what the HOA's response might be. The demand letter went out on Friday, sent via certified mail to both the HOA board and Prestige Community Management. Richard's letter was 5 pages long, dense with legal citations and clear in its requirements. The cameras must be removed or repositioned within 14 days to eliminate any view of my private residence, or we would proceed with litigation. That weekend, I tried to relax, but I found myself constantly checking the cameras, wondering if they were recording. I had ordered blackout curtains online, but they felt like a band-aid solution. Why should I have to live in darkness in my own home because the HOA had decided to invade my privacy? On Sunday afternoon, I was in my garage organizing tools when my neighbor from across the street, Tom, walked over. Tom was a retired accountant in his 60s, friendly but generally kept to himself. "Hey Marcus," he said, "I heard you are having some trouble with the HOA." Word traveled fast in this neighborhood. "Yeah," I said, "the cameras they installed are pointing right into my windows." Tom nodded slowly. "I noticed those cameras, thought they seemed a bit oddly positioned." Patricia came by my house last week, asking if I had seen any suspicious activity around the common areas. She was really pushing the vandalism angle, but honestly, I have not seen anything like that. I think she just wanted an excuse to install more cameras. Why would she want cameras everywhere? Tom shrugged. "Control. Patricia likes to know what everyone is doing. She has been board president for 5 years now, and every year she gets a little more intense about enforcement. Last year, she tried to implement a rule requiring prior approval for any visitors staying longer than 3 days. Can you imagine? Having to get HOA approval for your own house guests. Luckily, enough people pushed back that it did not pass. This was valuable information. It suggested a pattern of overreach, which could be useful if we ended up in court. "Thanks for telling me," I said. "Just watch your back," Tom warned. "Patricia does not like being challenged. She has gone after other people who fought HOA decisions. Suddenly they are getting violation notices for every tiny thing. Just be prepared." His words proved prophetic. On Tuesday, I received 3 violation notices in my mailbox. One claimed my house number was not clearly visible from the street, which was absurd since I had the standard bronze numbers mounted right next to my front door. Another said my front yard had weeds exceeding 3 inches in height. I went outside and examined my yard. There were a few tiny sprouts near the edge of the driveway, barely an inch tall. The third notice claimed I had an unauthorized vehicle parked on my driveway, a rusted truck. My truck was a 2019 Toyota Tacoma in excellent condition with a small amount of desert dust on it, which was normal for Arizona. It was obvious retaliation. Patricia was trying to bury me in petty violations to pressure me into backing down on the camera issue. I photographed everything, documenting that my house numbers were visible, measuring the so-called weeds, taking pictures of my perfectly fine truck from every angle. I forwarded everything to Richard. His response was immediate. "Perfect. This is documented retaliation." It actually strengthens our case. Do not respond to the violation notices yet. Let them keep digging their own hole. The 14-day deadline came and went. The cameras remained exactly where they were, still pointed at my windows. Richard filed the lawsuit the following Monday. The complaint was filed in Maricopa County Superior Court. We sued the HOA Board, Prestige Community Management, and Patricia Bloomfield personally for invasion of privacy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and retaliation. We requested an injunction to force the removal of the cameras, monetary damages, and attorney's fees. The lawsuit was public record, and within days, the story started spreading through the neighborhood. My phone buzzed constantly with texts and messages from neighbors, some supportive, some nosy, a few hostile. One neighbor, a guy named Derek who was friends with Patricia, sent me a long text about how I was damaging property values and making the neighborhood less safe by opposing security measures. I did not bother responding. The HOA's attorney entered an appearance within the required time frame. His name was Martin Kellerman, a lawyer with a large firm that specialized in representing HOAs throughout Arizona. The fact that they had hired a big firm rather than using a smaller practice suggested they were taking this seriously, which was either good or bad depending on your perspective. Kellerman filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the HOA had broad discretion to take security measures and that my privacy concerns were overblown. He claimed I had no reasonable expectation of privacy for anything visible from outside my home, and that the cameras only captured the exterior of my house, not the interior. This was demonstrably false based on my photographs, but it was a legal strategy. Richard filed an opposition brief, attaching dozens of photos showing exactly what the cameras could see. He included time-stamped images taken from inside my home showing that the cameras had direct sight lines into my bedroom, bathroom, and office. He also included an affidavit from a security camera expert who reviewed the positioning and confirmed that the cameras were deliberately aimed at my windows, not at common areas. While we waited for the judge to rule on the motion to dismiss, things in the neighborhood got worse. Patricia had apparently decided that a full-scale campaign against me was necessary. She started posting in the community Facebook group about residents who undermined community safety and wasted HOA resources with frivolous complaints. She did not mention me by name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. Then the harassment got more direct. I started receiving robocalls on my cell phone at odd hours, the kind where you answer and there is just silence or hang-up. My trash cans were knocked over twice in 1 week, garbage strewn across my driveway. Someone egged my truck one night while it was parked in my driveway. I installed my own security camera above my garage, pointed at my driveway and front yard. 2 nights later, it caught someone in a hoodie approaching my house around 2 in the morning and spray painting something on my garage door. The figure was too distant and the lighting too poor to make a definitive identification, but the body type and movements looked like a younger person, maybe a teenager. When I went outside the next morning, I found the word snitch spray painted in red across my garage door. I called the Phoenix Police Department and filed a report. The officer who responded was sympathetic but realistic. Without a clear identification, there is not much we can do, he explained. Could be kids, could be someone with a grudge. Keep your cameras running and call us if it happens again. I sent the police report and my camera footage to Richard. This is escalating into criminal territory, he wrote back. If you feel unsafe, document everything and do not hesitate to call the police. This kind of harassment is completely unacceptable and will only make the HOA's legal position worse. The judge denied the HOA's motion to dismiss in early April. Her written order was scathing. She wrote that the photographs presented by the plaintiff clearly showed cameras positioned in a manner that could capture activities inside the plaintiff's residence, and that this raised serious questions about invasion of privacy that could not be resolved at the motion to dismiss stage. She ordered the case to proceed to discovery. Discovery was the phase where both sides could request documents, ask written questions, and take depositions. Richard immediately sent out comprehensive discovery requests to the HOA. He asked for all documents related to the decision to install the cameras, all communications between board members about the cameras, any footage the cameras had recorded, and information about who had access to that footage. The HOA's responses were delayed and evasive. They claimed many documents were protected by attorney-client privilege. They said the cameras recorded over themselves every 72 hours, so no historical footage was available. They provided heavily redacted email chains that raised more questions than they answered. Richard filed a motion to compel, asking the judge to force the HOA to provide complete responses. At the hearing on that motion, Kellerman argued that the HOA had provided everything required under the rules. Richard countered by pointing out specific gaps and contradictions in the HOA's responses. Judge Morrison, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had been on the bench for over a decade, was not impressed with the HOA's approach. "Mr. Kellerman," she said, "your client's discovery responses appear designed to obscure rather than illuminate. I am ordering full compliance within 21 days. If the HOA continues to stonewall, I will consider sanctions." The threat of sanctions worked. 3 weeks later, the HOA produced a massive document dump. Thousands of pages of emails, meeting minutes, financial records, and communications. Richard and I spent days going through them, and what we found was stunning. The cameras had not been installed in response to vandalism at all. The emails revealed that Patricia had pushed for the cameras specifically to monitor my property. In one email to another board member, she wrote, "Marcus Webb has been a problem since he moved in. Always questioning our decisions, always pushing back on violations. We need to keep a closer eye on him. The cameras will let us document any violations in real time." Another board member had expressed concern. "Are we allowed to point cameras at someone's house like that? Seems like a privacy issue." Patricia's response, "It is our property. We can put cameras wherever we want. If he does not like it, he can move." There were also financial documents showing that Patricia had approved the camera installation without putting it to a full board vote, spending over $12,000 of HOA funds on her own authority. The HOA's bylaws required board approval for any expenditure over $5,000. Richard called me as soon as he finished reviewing the documents. "Marcus, this is even better than I hoped. We have emails showing intentional targeting, we have evidence of financial impropriety, and we have Patricia explicitly dismissing privacy concerns. This is going to trial and we are going to win." But before we got to trial, something unexpected happened. In late May, I received a call from my neighbor Lisa, who lived 3 houses down. She was a single mother with 2 young kids, and we had always gotten along well. "Marcus," she said, her voice shaking, "I need to tell you something. I did not realize how serious this was until I heard about the lawsuit. Those cameras, they can see into my daughter's bedroom window too. She is 8 years old, Marcus. I looked at the angle after I heard about your case, and the camera on the east side has a clear view into her room. I feel sick about it." My blood ran cold. An 8-year-old girl's bedroom being potentially surveilled. This had gone from an invasion of privacy to something potentially criminal. "Lisa, you need to document this immediately," I told her. "Take photos showing what the camera can see, and you should call the police. If there is video footage of a child's bedroom, that could be a serious crime." She agreed, her voice still trembling. I immediately called Richard and told him about this development. His tone became extremely grave. "This changes everything," he said. "If those cameras captured footage of a minor in a state of undress or in a private setting like a bedroom, we are talking about potential child exploitation charges. I am going to contact the police myself and make sure they are aware of this." Within 2 days, the Phoenix Police Department's Special Victims Unit opened an investigation. Detectives came to the neighborhood and interviewed Lisa, examined the camera angles, and requested all footage from the HOA. The HOA initially refused, claiming the footage had been overwritten, but the detectives obtained a warrant and seized the entire video system, including the hard drives from the security company's servers. The investigation took weeks, and during that time, the neighborhood was in chaos. Parents were furious, demanding answers about what the cameras had recorded and who had access to it. There were calls for Patricia's resignation. Emergency HOA meetings were held, which turned into shouting matches. Patricia doubled down, insisting the cameras were legal and necessary. She showed up at one community meeting with her lawyer and refused to answer questions, citing the ongoing litigation. This only made people angrier. In mid-June, the police investigation reached a conclusion. The detectives held a press conference, which was covered by local news stations. They announced that after forensic analysis of the seized hard drives, They had recovered footage showing that the cameras had indeed captured video of Lisa's daughter's bedroom window, including footage of the child changing clothes on at least 3 occasions. They had also found evidence that Patricia had accessed this footage multiple times. Patricia was arrested and charged with voyeurism, a Class 5 felony under Arizona law. The statute specifically prohibited using cameras to capture images of another person in a place where they had a reasonable expectation of privacy without their consent, particularly when it involved a minor. The arrest was dramatic. News helicopters filmed as police officers led Patricia out of her house in handcuffs, her face red with anger and humiliation. She screamed at the officers that this was all a misunderstanding, that she had been monitoring for vandalism, that she had never intended to record anyone's private activities. But intention did not matter much under Arizona's voyeurism statute. What mattered was that she had installed cameras positioned to capture private areas and had accessed that footage. The fallout was immediate and massive. Prestige Community Management terminated their contract with Saguaro Springs HOA, not wanting the reputational damage. 3 of the 5 HOA board members resigned within days of Patricia's arrest. The remaining 2 called an emergency meeting and unanimously voted to remove all the cameras immediately. I watched from my window as a crew came and dismantled the cameras, pulling down the poles and hauling everything away. It felt like a small victory, but the situation was far from resolved. Richard filed an amended complaint, adding claims on behalf of Lisa and her daughter as additional plaintiffs. We now had an even stronger case with documented evidence of criminal conduct by the HOA board president. The HOA's insurance company got involved. They sent their own lawyers to assess the situation, and those lawyers quickly concluded that the HOA's position was legally indefensible. They recommended settling the case immediately to minimize damages. In August, we received a settlement offer. The HOA agreed to pay me $200,000 in damages, issue a formal apology, and implement new policies requiring independent legal review before any surveillance equipment could be installed on HOA property. Lisa and her daughter would receive a separate settlement of $300,000, with the bulk of it placed in a trust for the daughter's future. Additionally, the HOA agreed to pay all of our attorney's fees, which had climbed to over $75,000 by that point. Richard advised me that the settlement was fair and that going to trial would be risky and time-consuming, even with our strong case. I agreed to the terms. Lisa also accepted her settlement. Patricia's criminal case moved forward separately. Her lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor's office was not inclined to be lenient given the involvement of a child victim. In October, Patricia pleaded guilty to 1 count of voyeurism and was sentenced to 2 years in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. She was also required to register as a sex offender, which effectively destroyed what remained of her reputation and her life as she knew it. The rest of the HOA board was replaced in a special election held in November. The new board was younger and more progressive, focused on creating a community rather than enforcing petty rules. One of their first acts was to revise the HOA's governing documents to include stronger privacy protections and oversight requirements for any security measures. As for me, I used part of the settlement money to upgrade my house. I installed high-quality privacy windows that you could not see through from the outside, upgraded my landscaping with native plants that required minimal maintenance, and set up my own private security system that covered my property without invading anyone else's privacy. I also became something of a local advocate for HOA reform. I was interviewed by several news outlets about my experience, and I testified before the Arizona State Legislature when they considered a bill to strengthen homeowner protections against HOA overreach. The bill eventually passed, creating new requirements for transparency and accountability in HOA governance. Life in Seguero Springs gradually returned to normal, or at least a new normal. The neighborhood had been through a collective trauma, but it also brought people together in unexpected ways. There were more block parties, more neighbors talking to each other, more sense of actual community rather than just people living in proximity. Tom, my neighbor who had warned me early on about Patricia, became a good friend. We started a weekly tradition of grilling in one of our backyards and talking about everything from sports to politics to neighborhood gossip. Lisa and her daughter were doing well, considering everything they had been through. Lisa told me the settlement money had allowed her to set up her daughter with a therapist to process what had happened, and to start a college fund that would give her daughter opportunities Lisa never had. One evening in December, almost a year after I first noticed the cameras, I was sitting on my back patio watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in shades of orange and purple. My phone buzzed with a message from Richard Chen. "Saw your testimony on the HOA reform bill," he wrote. "Really impressive, Marcus. You turned a terrible situation into meaningful change. That takes courage." I smiled and typed back a thank you. It had taken courage, more than I knew I had when this whole thing started. But it had also taken stubbornness, a refusal to accept that my privacy and dignity were less important than an HOA board president's desire for control. The truth was, I had been lucky in many ways. I had the resources to hire a good lawyer. I had neighbors who supported me, or at least did not actively work against me. I had documented everything thoroughly from the beginning, and the case had become so egregious, with the involvement of a child victim, that it was impossible for the system to ignore. But I also knew that thousands of homeowners across the country were dealing with HOA abuses every day, and most of them did not have the resources or the clear-cut case that I had. That was why the legislative advocacy felt important. Systemic problems needed systemic solutions. As winter settled over Phoenix, bringing cool nights and mild days, I found myself appreciating my home in a way I had not in years. The view from my windows was mine again. The privacy I had taken for granted had been restored. And more than that, I had learned something valuable about standing up for yourself, even when it was difficult and uncertain. The cameras were gone. Patricia was in prison. The HOA had been reformed. Justice, imperfect and slow as it was, had ultimately prevailed. But the experience had changed me. I was more vigilant now, more aware of how easily rights could be eroded in the name of rules and order. I paid closer attention to HOA meetings, read the minutes, asked questions. I encouraged other homeowners to do the same. In January of the following year, I attended my first HOA board meeting under the new leadership. The meeting was held in the community center, a beige building with folding chairs and a podium. About 30 residents showed up, which was a much better turnout than the typical 5 or 6 who used to attend when Patricia ran things. The new board president, a man named James who worked as a high school teacher, opened the meeting with a statement about transparency and community input. "We want this to be your HOA, not something imposed on you," he said. "We work for you, not the other way around." It was a small thing, but it mattered. The tone was different, the approach was different. During the open comment period, I stood up and introduced myself, though most people in the room already knew who I was. "I just want to say thank you to the new board for taking a different approach," I said. "What happened last year with the cameras should never have happened, and I appreciate that you are taking steps to make sure nothing like that happens again." There was applause, which felt a bit awkward but also affirming. Other residents stood up and shared their own stories of past HOA conflicts, smaller than mine but no less frustrating. There was the woman who had been fined for planting roses in the wrong color. The man who had been threatened with a lien on his house because he installed a solar panel without pre-approval, even though Arizona law protected homeowners' rights to solar energy. the couple who had been harassed about their son's basketball hoop in the driveway. The meeting lasted 2 hours, and by the end, the board had agreed to review and revise dozens of outdated or overly restrictive rules. It felt like the beginning of something better. Over the following months, I watched as Sagaro Springs transformed. The new rules were more reasonable, focused on genuine community concerns rather than aesthetic micromanagement. Enforcement became less about gotcha violations and more about working with homeowners to resolve issues. The change was not instant or complete. There were still disputes, still disagreements about what the rules should be and how they should be applied. But there was also dialogue, flexibility, and a sense that residents had a voice. I continued my remote work from home, now without the anxiety of being surveilled. My home office, with its view of the desert landscape and distant mountains, became a place of genuine peace rather than stress. I was more productive, more creative, more content. In March, I ran into Derek, the neighbor who had sent me the angry text about damaging property values when I first filed the lawsuit. We were both at the neighborhood grocery store, reaching for items in the same aisle. There was an awkward moment of recognition, and then he spoke. "Hey Marcus, I owe you an apology. I did not understand what was really going on with those cameras. I just heard Patricia's side and believed her. When the truth came out about what she did to that little girl, I felt sick. I am sorry I gave you a hard time." I was surprised but appreciated the gesture. "Thanks, Derek, I get it. Patricia was very convincing, and it is easy to trust people in positions of authority." We talked for a few more minutes, and while I would not call us friends, the hostility was gone. It was another small sign of healing in the community. As spring arrived and temperatures started climbing toward the brutal Phoenix summer, I found myself reflecting on the entire experience. It had been exhausting, stressful, expensive, and at times frightening, but it had also been necessary. I thought about what might have happened if I had not noticed the cameras that Tuesday morning, or if I had noticed, but decided it was not worth fighting. The surveillance would have continued. Patricia would have remained in power, possibly escalating her control tactics. Other residents would have continued to suffer under her authoritarian approach, and Lisa's daughter would have continued to be unknowingly filmed in her own bedroom, a violation that could have had lasting psychological effects. By standing up, by refusing to accept the unacceptable, I had not just protected myself. I had protected others. That realization carried weight. I also thought about the systemic issues the case had exposed. HOAs existed in a strange legal space, with significant power over homeowners, but often minimal oversight. They could impose fines, place liens on properties, and enforce rules that might be unreasonable or even illegal. Homeowners often signed away rights without fully understanding what they were agreeing to, buried in pages of dense legal documents at closing. The reform legislation I had helped advocate for was a step forward, but there was more work to be done. HOAs needed better checks and balances, more transparency requirements, and clearer legal limits on their authority. In April, I was contacted by a journalist working on a longer investigative piece about HOA abuses across the country. She had read about my case and wanted to include it as a central example. I agreed to an extensive interview, walking her through the entire timeline, providing documents and photos, and connecting her with Richard Chen and Lisa for additional perspectives. The article was published in June in a major national magazine. It was a comprehensive examination of how HOAs had grown in power and number over the past few decades, now governing millions of homes across America, and how that power was often abused. My case was featured prominently, along with dozens of other stories of HOA overreach, from foreclosures over minor fine disputes to discrimination against families with children to disabled homeowners being denied reasonable accommodations. The article generated significant attention and conversation. It was shared widely on social media, discussed on news programs, and cited by legislators in several states considering HOA reform bills. I received messages from homeowners all over the country who were dealing with their own HOA nightmares. Some wanted advice on how to fight back. Others just wanted to share their stories with someone who would understand. I tried to respond to as many as I could, offering what guidance and encouragement I could provide. One message that stuck with me came from a veteran in Florida whose HOA was trying to force him to remove a small flagpole from his front yard, despite federal law protecting homeowners' rights to display the American flag. I connected him with resources and legal organizations that could help. A few months later, he sent me an update. The HOA had backed down after receiving a letter from his attorney citing the federal statute. These small victories mattered. Each one was a reminder that systems of power could be challenged, that individuals were not powerless against institutions. By the time summer fully arrived, with temperatures regularly exceeding 110 degrees, life in Saguaro Springs had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The trauma of the camera scandal had faded, though it was not forgotten. The community had learned lessons about vigilance, about questioning authority, about standing up for what was right. I had also moved forward personally. I started dating someone I met through a hiking group, a teacher named Sarah who appreciated my story but was more interested in talking about books, travel, and the future than dwelling on past conflicts. It was refreshing to have parts of my life that had nothing to do with HOAs or lawsuits. In August, on the anniversary of the settlement, I drove past the spots where the cameras had been installed. The poles were gone, removed completely rather than just having the cameras taken down. Grass had grown in where the concrete bases had been excavated. You would never know anything had been there. I thought about Patricia, somewhere in the Arizona prison system serving her sentence. I did not feel satisfaction in her punishment, but I did not feel sympathy either. She had made choices, deliberate choices to violate people's privacy, to abuse her authority, and to dismiss the concerns of those she was supposed to serve. The consequences were her own doing. The civil settlement money had been useful, allowing me to make improvements to my house and build up my savings. But more valuable than the money was the peace of mind, the restoration of privacy, and the knowledge that I had stood up for myself and others. In September, the new HOA board asked if I would be interested in joining as a member. They had an opening and thought my experience would be valuable. I considered it carefully. Part of me wanted to say no, to distance myself from anything HOA-related after everything that had happened. But another part of me recognized that change required participation. If people who cared about fairness and rights did not get involved in governance, then people like Patricia would fill that vacuum. I agreed to serve, with the condition that it would be a one-year trial to see if it was a good fit. The board agreed, and in October, I was officially appointed to fill the vacant seat. My first few board meetings were a learning experience. I discovered that running an HOA, when done properly, was actually quite complex. There were budgets to manage, vendors to coordinate with, maintenance issues to address, and legitimate disputes between neighbors to mediate. It was not just about enforcing rules. It was about maintaining infrastructure, managing shared resources, and trying to balance competing interests. But it could be done in a way that respected residents' rights and dignity. That was the key difference. In November, we faced a situation that tested the new board's approach. A resident had installed a large metal sculpture in his front yard without approval. It was abstract and modern, definitely not to everyone's taste. The old HOA would have immediately issued a violation notice and demanded removal. Instead, we scheduled a meeting with the homeowner to discuss it. He explained that his late wife had been a sculptor, and the piece was one of her works that he wanted to display in her memory. It was deeply personal to him. The board discussed options. We looked at the governing documents, which did have restrictions on yard art, but also had provisions for reasonable accommodations in special circumstances. We proposed a compromise. The sculpture could remain, but perhaps positioned slightly differently to be less prominent from the street, and with some landscaping around it to integrate it better with the yard. The homeowner agreed. The neighbors who had complained were satisfied with the compromise. It was not perfect for anyone, but it was reasonable for everyone. That was how governance should work, I realized. Not through rigid enforcement of arbitrary rules, but through dialogue, flexibility, and respect for people's individual situations while still maintaining community standards. As the year drew to a close, I found myself in an unexpected place emotionally. What had started as one of the worst experiences of my life had ultimately led to positive changes, both for me personally and for the community. I had gained confidence, purpose, and a deeper understanding of how important it was to engage with the systems that governed daily life. I had also gained respect for the legal system, despite its flaws. It had been slow and expensive, but it had ultimately delivered justice. The courts had recognized that my privacy rights mattered, that Patricia's abuse of power was unacceptable, and that HOAs were not above the law. On New Year's Eve, the neighborhood held a community party in the park. It was a casual affair with a potluck dinner, music, and fireworks at midnight. I went with Sarah, and we stood among dozens of neighbors, watching the sky light up with colors. Tom came over with his wife, and we talked about how different things were compared to a year ago. Lisa was there too, with her kids, laughing and relaxed in a way I had not seen when this all started. As midnight approached and the countdown began, I looked around at the community, imperfect and complicated but also resilient and capable of change. The cameras were gone. Patricia was gone. The fear and surveillance that had poisoned the neighborhood had been eliminated. In their place was something better. A community learning to govern itself with fairness, to respect individual rights while maintaining shared spaces, and to hold power accountable when it overreached. The countdown reached 0, and fireworks exploded overhead. Sarah squeezed my hand and I smiled, genuinely happy. The nightmare was over. The lawsuit had succeeded, privacy had been restored, and life finally could move forward. In the new year, I continued serving on the HOA board and found the work surprisingly fulfilling. We tackled projects that actually improved the community, repaving deteriorating roads, upgrading the community park with new equipment, and implementing a more efficient system for handling maintenance requests. We also continued reforming policies. In February, we passed new guidelines that explicitly prohibited any surveillance equipment that could capture private property or residences. We required that any future security measures be reviewed by an independent attorney to ensure legal compliance before implementation. And we created a resident advisory committee to provide input on major decisions, making governance more democratic and transparent. The changes were noticed beyond just our community. Other HOAs in the Phoenix area started reaching out, asking about our new policies and how we had rebuilt after the scandal. I participated in several panels and workshops, sharing lessons learned and encouraging other communities to prioritize rights and respect over rigid control. In March, I received a message from Richard Chen. He had been contacted by a homeowner in Tucson facing a similar situation with HOA cameras, though not as extreme as mine had been. He asked if I would be willing to speak with this person, to share my experience and offer advice. I agreed without hesitation. The homeowner's name was David, and when we spoke by phone, I heard the same frustration and violation I had felt. I walked him through the steps I had taken, the legal theories that had worked, and the importance of documentation. I also connected him with Richard, who agreed to take the case. 6 months later, David's case settled favorably, with the HOA removing the cameras and paying damages. It was another small victory, another instance of rights being protected and power being checked. By summer, my one-year commitment to the HOA board was ending. I had to decide whether to continue. The board had asked me to stay on, and several neighbors had expressed their hope that I would. I talked it over with Sarah, who had become a steady presence in my life. We had spent the past year building a relationship, and she had her own perspective on my involvement with the HOA. "I think you should do what feels right," she said. "But from what I have seen, you are making a real difference. The community is better because you are involved. That matters." I decided to stay on for another term. The work was important, and I had learned that change required sustained effort, not just dramatic interventions. As the second anniversary of discovering the cameras approached in the fall, I realized how much had changed in that time. The physical cameras were long gone, but their impact lingered in positive ways. The community was more engaged, more aware, and more protective of individual rights. Patricia remained in prison, with no early release expected. Her case had become something of a cautionary tale in HOA circles, a reminder of how badly things could go wrong when power went unchecked. The legal precedent from my case had been cited in several other privacy lawsuits against HOAs across the country. It was contributing to a broader shift in how courts viewed HOA authority, recognizing that homeowners did not give up their constitutional rights simply by living in a community with an HOA. In November, I was invited to speak at a national conference on HOA governance in Las Vegas. The audience included HOA board members, management company representatives, and attorneys from across the country. I told my story, emphasizing not just what had gone wrong but what had been done to make it right. During the question and answer session, a woman raised her hand. She was a board president from a community in Colorado. "How did you maintain your resolve when things got difficult?" she asked. "When you were being harassed and it felt like the HOA had all the power." I thought about it for a moment before answering. I kept reminding myself that what was happening was wrong, fundamentally wrong. Not just annoying or inconvenient, but a violation of basic rights. And I knew that if I did not stand up to it, it would continue and probably get worse. Sometimes doing the right thing is hard, but that does not make it any less right. The response resonated with the audience. After my talk, several people came up to share their own stories or to thank me for speaking out. Flying back to Phoenix that evening, I looked out the airplane window at the lights of the city spreading across the desert below. Each light represented homes, families, communities. Some were probably dealing with HOA issues right now, feeling powerless against rules and enforcement that seemed arbitrary or excessive. I could not fix all of those situations, but I had fixed mine. And in doing so, I had created a template others could follow, a legal precedent they could cite, and hopefully some inspiration that resistance was possible. When I got home, I stood in my living room and looked out my windows at the quiet street, the desert landscape beyond, the stars visible in the clear night sky. My windows, my view, my privacy, all restored, all protected, all mine again. The cameras had crossed limits, violating not just privacy laws but basic human dignity. The HOA had been sued, held accountable, and forced to relocate those cameras to the scrap heap where they belonged. Justice had been slow and difficult, but it had arrived. And in the process, a community had been transformed, policies had been reformed, and one homeowner had learned that even against powerful institutions, individuals could fight back and win. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed that night, I felt something I had not felt in that first dark period after discovering the surveillance: complete peace in my own home. It had been worth fighting for, worth the stress and expense and uncertainty, because in the end, privacy matters. Rights matter, and standing up against those who would violate them matters most of all.